Indy Johar is a Senior Innovation Associate at the Young Foundation in the UK and the co-founder of Dark Matter Laboratories. It sounds scarier than it is. Dark Matter is an organization that looks at seemingly local or isolated kind of challenges, figures out the systemic pieces that's keeping those challenges kind of locked, and figures out how to turn interdependencies into solutions. Indy has co-founded multiple social ventures, from impact hubs in Westminster and Birmingham, UK, to the open venture accelerator hublaunchpad.net. He's a big thinker who has spoken in capitals around the world, and his speech tonight takes the subjects of the next 4 days and kind of sets the stage for us, showing them how they all fit together. Please, everyone, join me in welcoming Indy Johar.
Hello, good evening. I'm honored and delighted to be here. In a way, I think jumping over the pond, I had to turn around and say, you know, we are all looking at Canada right now as the great hope of the West. So you have a lot to deliver, so we are really all looking here. I suppose, in a way, I want to talk a little bit about change, and in a way, how change happens. And in a way, we've been focused on a very particular idea of change over the last 20 to 30 years. And some of those notions and conversations are being challenged. And I'd like to take you through a little journey around that stuff. I'm between you and first course, so I'm going to hold you out here. Can I wonder if I could have my slides? I think they're just getting there. So, in a way, I think we sit at a very interesting moment where I think the challenges that Caitlin spoke about are now being amplified, not only are being amplified throughout our society. I don't know about Canada, but in many other locations, what we're seeing is wages stagnate, if not fall. Actually, what we're seeing is actually a structural undermining of middle classes in pretty much all of the Western economies that we're starting to look at. Those wages are actually putting a huge amount of conversation around the working poor and the growth of the working poor. Combining all of this conversation, and we know all the big issues, you're also getting a real challenge around democratic legitimacy. Certainly in many parts, what we're seeing is actually the voters increasingly doesn't drive a new legitimacy of change. In fact, if you look at most of the analysis that's going on, is we're seeing polarization of left and right, and politics increasingly becoming divisive and actually challenging. So legitimacy in this conversation is becoming a really, really big, important, and challenging discourse. When you put these two things together, I think we sit at a very interesting moment. And the slides are still waiting. And in that challenge, I think where we sit is, how do we drive change? And over the last few years, we've actually really been focused on a very particular model of change. Slowly, certainly in the UK, in many of the contexts, change has been focused on outsourcing innovation, certainly from the public sector and the state sector, and increasingly over the last few years, being actually focused on the words of social enterprise, you'll have heard it, and impact investment, and how change will be led from actually these startups. And the discourse of change has become increasingly narrowed into this conversation. Now, in the UK, we put together something called Big Society Capital. Big Society Capital was £600 million, it is, focused on investing into social change. You say that's pretty impressive, right? But let me put this into context. And the context is, in the UK, we buy £1 billion of ice cream a year. 600 million capital, £1 billion of ice cream. Our annual spend into welfare is circa 400 billion. So when we start to look at the quantum of actually capital and flow and the nature of where we see change, I think we're sitting in a very interesting moment. And that moment is not going to necessarily be solved by looking at single-point architectures like social enterprise and impact. And when you look at the theory of change, you start to realize, well, actually change has never been, certainly social change, has never been the focus of startups. Black Lives Matter, a big campaign going on in the US, is actually a real movement. Look at how changes historically occurred. It is a movement of actors and individuals and policy and regulation, as well as real change on the ground. It is not going to be delivered by single corporate actors. And when you start to look at some of this conversation, you start to see, actually, we are being narrowed into a model of change. How do we finance that form of change? How do we structure change into that model? And when you start to look at that, you start to see there's very interesting stories. So when you look at, and if my slides were up, which I think they're still struggling with, if you look at actually those models of change, you start to see one. I'll tell you a couple of stories. It's a good example of change. In India, you have the largest number of deaths that happen on the road. It's got the largest number of deaths on the road. Unfortunately, a friend of mine, his close friend passed away. He was working in the US. He decided to go to India, said he wanted to do something about it. He went there. His friend was lying on the road for 45 minutes and nobody had helped him. 45 minutes. Was this an empathy gap? No. People were afraid of the police. People were afraid of the police because they would be taken in. And taken in for questioning, and you can all imagine the rest. So what he decided to do was actually launch a big campaign, had a judicial review, Supreme Law Court ruling, and actually drove some legislation to prevent that happening. Now, when this had happened, what he realized was, who were the men and women taking people to hospital? There weren't any ambulances. Well, it was the policemen and women. So he set up a reward scheme, recognizing policemen and women saving lives. When these people got to hospital, what was happening? Although there was legal architecture to actually drive and encourage people, well, required to be treated, people were being left at the back of the queue. So what did he do? He turned around and said, okay, he lobbied government for actually driving toll roads. All toll roads in India now have health insurance buried into them. Because he knew the only way to drive this was to actually do that. Now, all toll roads being developed have automatic health insurance. As a result of that, ambulances turned up on the roads. As a result of that, people are starting to be treated. Off the back of that, what you start to see, he finally built the tech app, the equivalent to building a 999 service, or a 911, I don't know what you have in equivalent. Why do I talk about this? When you look at this model of change, it isn't the change of a single hero, it isn't the change of a single intervention, actually it's a change of multiple points of intervention. When you look at any of this story, you start to realize that actually a lot of this stuff is actually a plural. Multiple points of intervention drive change. And we mustn't get seduced that a tech app is suddenly going to change the world for us. Hello, next slide. And in a way, that's only one part of the story. So when you start to look at the next part, you start to see there's a beautiful town in Todmorden called Edinburgh Todmorden. It's a woman, two women went around and turned around and planted every part of that town with edible food. 7 years later, unemployment rates are down, depression rates are down, number of shops lying empty is down. Why? Because actually all that edible food wasn't about the food, it was about building, bridging social capital. It got everyone out on the streets. It built relationships. Now, which one of you, if you were all economic development officers, and I was to say, give me a policy to drive economic improvement, who would turn around here and say, I tell you what, I'll make my town edible? You'd all give me a startup fund. Why I say this is that what you start to realize is when you look at this stuff, there are oblique points of intervention. Intervention which is non-directly, you don't have to do a startup fund. What they realized was actually building the bridging social capital of the town had huge impact all across those issues. So how do we create these new type of institutional behaviors which allow us to drive change in new ways? And in that model, I think my thesis is that if you look at change, it is no longer causal and linear. And in that model, I want to take you back now. I think, as a civilization, we've been living at 500 years of a very particular model of how we see the world. An enlightenment model, a Newtonian enlightenment model, which basically is all been about isolating things. Isolating science from art, maths from physics, corporates from state, public from private. It's been a model that's been incredibly successful. It's allowed us to work in an assumption of the infinite world, which is what we had 300 years ago, 400 years ago, at the centerpiece of this conversation. But increasingly, what we're starting to realize is that this model of isolation is no longer viable. Climate change, global financial crisis, actually some of the issues that we're starting to see erupt are no longer able to be addressed in corporate forms. And actually, what we're starting to realize is the system effects are larger than the corporate structures that we talk about. So as we start to realize this interdependency, how do we start to organize? What do our institutions look like, which we've built all along as an idea of isolation? Fiduciary responsibility is around the corporate, not actually the societal risks that are structured around the corporate. It's increasingly being narrowed. So how do we start to talk about the new institutions for an age of interdependency? What does a balance sheet look like when you look at the shared risks of those balance sheets? And when you start to go further, how do we start to reimagine these institutions? Still, next. Let's see if we can do this manually. And next. In a way, and if we go next, we will do this manually. This is a good example. It's a piece of work that was done around fisheries and declining fish stock. It was done with citizens by the Academy of Systems Change, MIT. They spent 2 years actually building a map of all the relationships around why fish stock were declining. The local authority is a very small actor to the top left. Gang violence was a big issue in reasons for declining fish stock. Things that were non-linear, non-predictable, non-direct had huge factors in these stories. Why I put this up is that it's really increasingly becoming apparent that actually the interdependencies of things around us are non-linear and non-predictable. And when you want to try to drive change, you end up having to look at change from a systems lens. Your leverage points aren't as straightforward. Now, the important thing about this diagram, and I will stress this here, I'm not advocating that you hire a consultant to map a system. The point wasn't doing the system diagram. The point of this was actually citizens and everyone being involved in doing the diagram. The point was actually building the system consciousness of the actors involved, the system intelligence, recognizing the interdependency of people involved. It wasn't about actually a third party, and I'll use McKinsey's as the fall guys, a McKinsey solution who would walk in and define the system and describe you the leverage points. It wasn't that model of change. So when we start to look at it from this lens, what are our institutions? What are our balance sheets? How do we start to understand risk? How do we start to understand interdependency? These are some of the questions that I think we genuinely face in our age and are really important. Next, please. I don't know why I'm holding this placebo effect. And in a way, I think I would like to challenge one of the other things that we're starting to see, the language of public-private divide. I'm going to be ruthless on both sides of the conversation. One side, let's be really honest. The public, well, it probably gets about 34% of the vote. So when we talk about public good, most governments are actually got about 34 to 40% of the vote. So when we talk about the public good, actually it's usually a club good. Certainly in the UK, we've got a government which has got about 34% of the vote and is preserving pensioner rights because that's actually its demographic vote. It's not necessarily the right decision, it's the voted decision, where the voted majority comes from. So when we talk about public, increasingly I'm not even saying the state is a public good. The state is a club good. And on the other hand, if we go to the next slide, hello. Corporates are starting to recognize that they carry risks which are actually outside the corporate boundary. So I was talking to a major housing association who've got £850 million of housing on their balance sheet. We had this very straightforward conversation with their CFO. Said, your housing stock, it's great, fantastic. What do you think the risks are to your housing stock? I said, well, you know, house prices go up and down. I said, okay, in the 1970s, and I'm sure the same was here, but the 1970s in the UK, when effectively the economic geography of many neighborhoods failed, most of those houses were worth next to nothing. In fact, had negative equity. So housing is actually just a proxy of the economic value of those neighborhoods. It's a proxy value. And if those economies fail, your housing is worth next to nothing. The reason why we were having this conversation was how could a CFO start to invest into the economic performance of the neighborhood in order to protect their balance sheet? So this was about enlightened self-interest and taking a systems approach to the risk they hold. So even corporates are starting to talk about shared risks and actually shared wealth, which is essential to their well-being. So how do we start to, if this interdependency is starting to be recognized, how do we start to bridge that conversation? How do we start to actually build a new language around this discourse? How do we start to underline and bridge those risks so that we can understand them together? These are the things that are important for when we talk about systems. Because unless we can put these architectures of shared risk and shared wealth together, actually we can't build some of the institutional infrastructure that's required to deal with the scale of problems where we need to address. Next, please. Next, please. Next, please. And in a way, I think what we're starting to all recognize is change is increasingly polycentric. It isn't the domain of local government or central government. It isn't going to be the domain of private sector or the citizen sector. Actually, we have to find a model of change which is around building movements. So when we talk, we're doing a piece of work around radical childcare, and we want a big issue in Birmingham. And what we realized very quickly was actually in order to build this conversation, we had to build a citizen conversation. You had to build the politics of this conversation as much as the ideas and the means of intervention. These two things went hand in hand. If you want to change the discourse, you have to change actually all the participants, the conversation of the participants. It is no longer enough to just advocate policy change without building the political architecture around it. So how do we start to build these movements of change to drive some of these conversations? I think is going to be fundamental in this story. Next, please. I've talked about this. These are the two ladies who did a lot of this stuff around oblique investments. They found, this is all Todd Morden, and these two fantastic women, one ex-leader of the council who turned around and effectively did all the edible Todd Morden work. This is important. Unless we can find mechanisms of investing obliquely and not get locked up into the problem that every solution is a startup fund, I don't think we start to drive change. I don't think we understand a lot of the social complexity that we operate with. Next, please. This was the car crash conversation. And in a way, we must be careful not to be seduced that actually it will be startups or actually social enterprises themselves that will drive the change. So how do we derive this polycentric model? Next, please. And this is important. We need to get away from the discourse of heroes. It's perhaps one of the most problematic things that's happened to us as a conversation. We believe it's a hero, a single point intervention, the magical silver bullet, the great leverage point. It isn't. Change requires many of us to work together. And we've become so used to the model of heroes and picking winners, picking individuals, that I think actually it's destroyed some of the means of change. How do we start to finance these movements of change? Ford Foundation is starting to do some really interesting work around this. How do we build movements around this story? Next, please. Next, please. And in this model, what becomes increasingly evident is you have to actually build the stack of the conversation. When you're building these movements, actually you have to build shared language, shared senses. How do you see the world together? Shared intelligence, smart policy, decision, actionability, all these things come. How do you build accountability in a shared mission? I'll give you a story. Harvard did a piece of research into 20 of the poorest neighborhoods in America, and they found one neighborhood was outperforming in terms of educational attainment all the others. They went down there, did a lot of ethnographic work, and discovered it was librarians. A librarian that was so passionate about teaching young people to read at the ages of 3 to 5 that actually the schools were outperforming. School was the same. Now, librarians, I don't know about here, but certainly in many parts of the world, are funded by the Culture Ministry or Department of Culture. They're funded for the books that go out of the library. Their mission isn't aligned to the educational process or the educational attainment of the area. So how do we talk about new forms of outcome actually if we don't even align the missions of organizations together on the ground? And this is within an organization. How do we drive these conversations? So if we want to talk about systems, we have to create the new accountability structures around that story. Next, please. And in a way, this conversation is opening up in many, many ways. This is another example of actually going beyond single-point startups as a means of change. This is something called OpenDesk, which I was part of, which builds open-source furniture. This open-source furniture can be delivered and printed in any location around the world now because of all these growth of fab labs that are happening all over. Within 7 miles of each other, within 7 miles of most cities, you can deliver actually open source furniture. This is no longer a corporate, it's a system. It's organizing open source design with actually delivery which is global. How are these systems being organized? What are the issues around this stuff? I think these are starting to be the key conversations. We'll carry on, please. Next, please. Next, please. Next, please. Next, please. When this was built, within 4 weeks it was being downloaded all over the world. Literally all over the world. And built. Pictures taken and released back. Next, please. People built their own factories. This is in Bristol, people were building their own factories and sending us pictures back of the furniture they'd done. Carry on, please. Carry on. And in a way, this conversation of change is also structured at the heart of actually how we're organizing our economics. Next, please. And our work. I'm going to present a thesis to you that I had the fortune of being at the Ford, at the Model T Ford factory. The thesis goes like this. As we instrumentalized work, we started to find meaning through consumption. So I happened to walk down the Model T Ford factory. The first Ford, second Ford, third Ford. By I think it was the seventh Ford, what you started to see, the advertising had gone from selling technical things to effectively selling a Ford with a woman draped over it. At the same time, what had happened was when Henry Ford was actually organizing work, he realized he had to pay $5, as the myth goes, to hold people in. That was the only because the retention rates were so low. He couldn't keep workers. 2/3 of his workers would leave every week. So he used to pay a lot of money. So here's a thesis for you. When you instrumentalize work, you turn it into actually a work which is effectively, you command and control people. The only way to find meaning is actually in the act of consumption. That is actually a thesis of how bad work generates a mal-consumer economy. In that thesis, if you look at that model, how do we start to unlock that? Bad work is perhaps a problem at the center of lots of conversations that we talk about. And if we go to the next slide, you start to realize there's something interesting going on. We often talk about the startup economy in California and the Californian ideology. Next slide, please. I had the fortune of spending some time out there, and it struck me there were three things that was being talked about in the Californian ideology, and they interrelate. One was abundance. Actually, the funding, the venture capital when it moved in, was actually funded for abundance and the culture of abundance that supported it. It wasn't funded for scarcity. It wasn't funded for how much money you just needed. It was funded to create abundance. Go out and build a monopoly, virtually. Second thing, there was an opt-in culture. What human capital can you opt into? Third thing was just doing it continuously. Now, what became apparent when you look at this model as a stack, this is a whole economic theory that goes counter to the supply and demand conversation we've been locked into. The scarcity of meeting supply and demand. This was about unlocking human capital and saying, okay, we're going to free human capital up, actually to over the Maslow's hierarchy middle period, for actual genuine self-actualization. This isn't a scarcity economics. This is about actually freeing human capital up. So when we talk about the citizen wage, or its equivalent in Canada is, the basic minimum wage. But if you talk about the citizen wage, which is now being discussed in many parts, where actually a universal income for everyone, this isn't about finding a new basic welfare model. Actually, it's about building an abundance economy. A lot of our thinking has been designed around scarcity economics. When you look at what's going on in the California model, it says actually when you take people out of that model and you start to invent new needs, new opportunities, you change the economic paradigm which people operate in. So maybe this kind of Karl Marx meets Adam Smith economics is finally coming to an end. Maybe it isn't about matching supply and demand and a producer-consumer reality, but actually about creating abundance to discover new needs and new opportunities in a way that's not been discovered. So when you start to look at this stuff, there's something fantastic going on. What would that mean if you did that at a nation-state level? You are going to see experiments like that. You are already seeing it in cities in Rotterdam and other cities, trying out new experiments to discover a fundamentally new, different economic behavior. I guarantee you this is coming. Because our supply and demand matching conversation isn't getting us there. Next, please. Next, please. This next point is super important. One of the big conversations that we've been having in Norway is about reframing welfare. And one of the big discourses has been that welfare is often perceived as a cost. Increasingly, the political narratives we're seeing witnessed are welfare is a cost. Here's a thesis for you guys. I think welfare is an investment. It's an investment to unlock human capital. It's not a cost. If it's an investment, it totally changes the frame of mind of discourse that you have about welfare. I'll give you an example. Homelessness in the UK costs between 34 to 40,000 pounds in terms of HR, emergency room costs, A&E costs, in terms of actually rapid intervention into those environments. We can choose to mitigate the problem, hide the problem, which is get people off the streets, police intervention cost. That's the lowest rung of the ladder. We can choose to give a house or housing, which cost about 13,000. We can actually create welfare services to actually help that individual thrive, which means you get the tax benefits. And then, most importantly, which we often forget, is actually creating the conditions for society. The National Health Service in the UK is not actually just a health service. It's one of the best anti-corruption measures you can put into society. Corruption occurs at points of health failure. Often people become vulnerable when a family member is actually put into a health crisis. That is when actually many issues in society and corruption occur. So when health is talked about, it isn't just a health service. It's actually a fundamental piece of architecture to deal with structural corruption in society. So when we start to look at these layers, you start to see welfare from a completely different lens. And the thesis I want to present to you is we've seen welfare presented as a cost, largely because actually state budgets are organized from a revenue basis. There is no long-term liability accounting. There's no 10-year accounts of welfare cost. In this model, actually we are seeing only the negative and never the opportunity that we let go of. So what happens when you start to perceive welfare as an investment? How do you perceive those outcomes? How do you start to organize that change? These models all put human capital at the center of the story. Whether it's a Californian ideology or whether it's welfare as investment. Human capital at the center of the model. Not assets, not wealth, but human capital. Next, please. So here's some challenges. And like any good conversation, I'm going to leave some questions here. Next. What is the language of this economy? Let me tell you, Twitter is not a corporate. Neither is Facebook. It's an institution. Why? Because it works as a natural monopoly. Facebook does not have competitors and nor is likely to. Neither is Google. Yet we use the language of corporates and free market in domains that are now pseudo-monopolies. Uber is designed to be a monopoly. We don't have the language or the taxonomy to understand these new types of things. They go beyond corporate and market dynamics. My thesis is to you that we're understanding this world from an old lens. because our language is no longer up to having that conversation. Corporate markets are old-fashioned views on what has now become a Michael Porter reality, where these are monopolies. We have ways of dealing with monopolies, right? They're called utilities. So it's not that we don't have mechanisms, but I think we need to invent new words. The language of this, we are in a different paradigm, yet we're using language of an old paradigm. And it's actually failing us in both sides of the debate. Next, please. We've seen the rise of social investment funds, who are all investing into products and services. How do we invest into systems? How do we invest into virtuous systems for educational outcomes? When we know a librarian investing into a librarian will have great outcomes. We know prenatal nutrition will have great shifts in outcomes. We know breakfast clubs, actually for children that are going to school without having breakfast, will have great impact. We know parent-teacher engagement will improve educational outcomes. Yet, we only think about the schools. How do we start to invest for outcomes, not just invest in a conversation which is predicated around the budget allocation? So imagine if the education department was holder of the outcome, not the means. And it was buying the mechanisms for the outcomes. Next, please. What if, in this conversation, democracy, and it's often misused, democracy is misunderstood as a mechanism of the vote? If you go back into history, what you very quickly realize, certainly in the UK, democracy was built by the democratization of capital, banks for the poor, then schools, then libraries, and then the vote. Democracy is not the vote. The vote is merely its articulation. How do we talk about the power to create society as being the fundamental measure of democracy? Would we hold up ourselves very well? Do we really democratize the power to create society? Or do we think the illusion of the vote is good enough? So what does democracy look like in this world, in this systems world? Next, please. What does regulation look like in a complex emergent world? Regulation is based on the idea of being able to predict what the impact will be and regulate it. In a complex, highly emergent world, how do you regulate? And maybe we need to go beyond regulation. Maybe we need to be thinking about feedback, regulating feedback, not the form and the outcome. I think all these norms that we become used to are at the point of being challenged. All our means of organizing and change are there to be challenged. Unless we do them, unless we challenge that, we are stuck into an old world. Next, please. How do you reimagine our town halls? If we believe that change is a system problem, what would a town hall look like which recognized the systems that were working? How would it be a platform for change when we know how representative democracy works versus a systems approach? How would we imagine them for the 21st century? I think we need to open ourselves up for these conversations. There are solutions, there are many people talking about them, but the real thing is we must open up these conversations. What are these institutional infrastructures? Next, please. And this goes all the way through. What do customer rights look like in a hybrid world, in a decentralized world of work? I think inhabitation rights are being talked about on Twitter. You inhabit these systems. All these things are open for discussion and need to be reinvented if we want to be appropriate for the world we live in. Next, please. And what does a balance sheet look like related to societal risk? What does fiduciary duty really mean? Fiduciary duty as a term has been very narrowed only over the last 20 years. How do we start to think about these things? It's thinking about these things which will drive and create the capacity for us to reinvent many of the things that we focus on. Next, please. What does leadership look like? Our leadership models have increasingly been focused on leading corporates, not the outcomes, not the mission, but the corporates. What does system leadership look like? How do you have those conversations? How do you convene those conversations? The behaviors are not the same. The behaviors aren't about command and control. The model of leadership is completely different. What does that look like? Next, please. Next, please. And in a way, we are in this age of building new institutions and new relationships. Open data is not just effectively a fad. It's about creating the architecture of interoperability. Social investment is not a fad. It's actually about understanding capital in different formats. We are already doing that journey. Last 10 years has been about a conversation of building that discourse. The real challenge is, how do we take the real systemic step forward? Like I say, actually less than 0.6 of the ice cream buyer of the UK. How do we go beyond that? Next, please. So my thesis to you, and in a way a challenge, is that I think we sit at a moment where reinventing our institutions fit for the 21st century is our challenge. You may think this is kind of like crazy. Most of the industrial age institutions were built at the same time. Trade unions were imagined at the same time as the Industrial Revolution. The challenge exists to reimagine those. And unless we open ourselves up to reimagining them, I don't think we create the opportunity for change. I think that is the central challenge we face. Not about building new gimmicks, new products, new ethical coffee cups. Actually, it's about having the structured conversation around institutions. And you'll be surprised how few people want to have them. Many parts of the world, the only discourse I hear is about burning the red tape. Burning regulation, reducing institutional overhead, reducing governance. I don't think it's about reducing. I think it's about fundamentally reinventing it. And I think unless we can do that, I don't think we can build an economy fit for purpose. I'll end with one last point. The global trade that we see, shipping trade that we see, was built in the 17th century because actually the private limited company was born by royal charter. The King of Portugal basically indemnified and said, historically, all shipping trade was done as partnerships. So if the ship sank, the investors were liable for all the loss of goods. He turned around and built a royal charter for ships, which basically meant that actually the investors were not liable for the loss of the ship. He indemnified them. Private limited liability companies were born. That allowed for money to flow into building ships, into allowing a global shipping trade to effectively be born. The relationship between institutional innovation is fundamental to actually unlocking the new economies of our age. Intellectual property was born in Venice in the 15th century. It was born to unlock intellectual property, which is locked in people's cupboards and books. It was meant to create the liquidity of intellectual property. Now it's become a means of control. All these institutional norms that we think are normal and normative are actually a byproduct of a way of seeing the world. all those things are being challenged. And in a way, the last 500 years of Enlightenment model thinking is being challenged and reinvented. And in a way, the relational economy of the medieval age is actually where we're heading back to, a new relational economics. You could theorize that actually the rise of the East is nothing to do with just actually China's demographics, that it's a rise of a new worldview. If you took a child who, from the East and showed them a painting, they would describe the context first, and they would describe the object last. If you took the same painting and showed it from a child born in the West, the child would describe the object, stop, and only when asked would describe the context. I think we've reached a paradigm shift in how our world operates. And I think Canada, with its First Nations, sits in a really interesting moment to build a new conversation. I think you indigenously have a different way of seeing the world. I think you have the opportunity to marry these conversations in a new way. And you're going to see it happen. The only question is, are we going to do it? Are we going to build the institutional hardware? Are we going to invest into that conversation? With that, I'm going to let you have your first courses, I think. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you very much, Indy. And thank you to Google, which is the sponsor of our keynote tonight. So Indy's talked about needing to challenge regulation, democracy, town halls. What he didn't mention is that everybody here tonight has surmounted a very important challenge. I see that there's still bread on the table. Congratulations, everybody. We're going to have some questions and answers with Indy a little later. For now, bon appétit. Hello again, everyone. I hope you're having a nice evening. Okay. Je vais vous demander votre attention, s'il vous plaît. Bonsoir, messieurs et mesdames. I know you've been waiting for this next part of the evening, so here we are. So good evening again, everyone. I hope that you're enjoying yourselves and meeting lots of interesting people. One of the many interesting people here tonight is a colleague of mine, the Foundation's Director of Development, Natalka Harris. Nat is a little bit new to the Foundation, but she's not new to fundraising, and she found me earlier and said how delighted she was that so many people have come up to her unsolicited to say, how can I make a donation to the Foundation? So this was very, very good news. Thank you to all of you very thoughtful people. For people who maybe have not yet thought of that, if you want to join the ranks of the interesting, then you can find Natalka. She's right here. Or you can go to the registration desk. We'd be happy to see you. So you'll have noticed that Indy is back. With him, our moderator for this question and answer session, Lilia Yumagoluva. Lily is a 2008 Trudeau Scholar. She's the co-director of research for the Crisis Resilience Alliance at the University of British Columbia. She's an expert in institutional adaptation to environmental risk in cities. So if you were worried about asking too tough questions, well, don't, because these two people are used to them. There's a microphone right there. Please go ahead.
Good evening, everyone. Can everybody hear me? Not quite, right? All right. So I would like to introduce some rules for discussion tonight. I come from Soviet Union and we like a very totalitarian approach to things. So here are the rules. As Caitlin said, we welcome uncomfortable conversations. This is what this space is for. So that's number one. Number two, Indy eloquently talked about oblique approaches. So when directly aiming at the goal is not necessarily the best way to get it. may I ask you to drop that for the question period? Ask your question in the most direct way possible. Thank you. And finally, the approach, policentric approach to change, shared language, shared senses, and yes, you remember. All right. Please take that with your heart. And when we ask questions, think about the shared values, shared language, and shared senses. Thank you. And who would like to get into the uncomfortable conversations first? I see Rob Thornburg, the master of conversations, wants to ask a question. And Taylor can go first. Thank you. Go ahead.
So much pressure now. I was actually wondering about the movement between heroes and movements, and whether a movement can really function without a hero. In government, for example, we have champions that bring forward ideas or complicated tasks that really try and impose a certain idea on the people below them. So how can a movement function without a hero?
Great question. I think what I'm trying to get to is not the idea that there isn't leadership, but actually what the role of that leadership is. Is the role of that leadership to become an icon, or is the role of that leadership to become an enabling architecture? I think it's about, there's always individuals, there are always great individuals that drive many of these conversations, but it's actually whether those individuals become the heroes. And actually, I'll give you an example. We did something called the Wiki House, which is open source housing. It's now built 30 different chapters around the world developing open source housing. One day in 2011, we got a phone call from TED. TED phoned us up and said, we want you to come to Global TED to present. Global TED is a conversation for one person to stand on a stage. Yet, the Wiki House is being built by hundreds of people and invented by hundreds of people. As soon as you bring the architecture of a single hero into the table, actually what you do is you isolate the hero from actually the communities that are building the innovation. It's actually as problematic for the hero as it is problematic for the communities. So I'm not saying that they aren't individuals. I think we all, I think it's about the language and the positioning of this conversation, and how we don't destroy actually the networks and the whole networks of innovation which drive these change by articulating a single point. I think there's some really beautiful articles being written about actually our culture of the superhero has become actually destructive of understanding how we collectively drive change. I think that's going to be one of the big conversations. The heroes of the real leaders of tomorrow are the people that stand behind the bus and push. And I think that requires us to have a different cognitive reality around this conversation. So it's not about discounting it. I just think it's a new framing around it rather than anything else.
Do we have another question?
Yes. Good evening. Thank you, Indy, for the inspiring talk. I've got a short comment and a question. Indy, you talked about the social spend in the UK, 400 billion. Here in Canada, it's about 340 billion spent on social outcomes. And as a practitioner, it feels like our change-making practice is stuck. And it almost feels like we're sort of coming to the end of practice, and that we need some new form of R&D to take us into what you've just sort of talked about. My question really is around something different. And I'm trained as an engineer, and when I used to work in engineering and design products, we would design products for the products to stop working at a certain point in time. Yeah. And so we designed products with obsolescence in mind. And so there were sort of points where you would have to sort of repair them. There are points where you'd have to send them back to the factory. And there's actually a certain point in time where we recommend that you stop using it because it doesn't actually interface well with its surrounding environment, the system that it operates in. And often in the spaces that I operate in sort of the social sector and the philanthropic sector, there's a sense of permanence to everything. And in social programs, in grant making, and all this sort of the stuff. And so as we think about sort of the institutions of the future, how do we design institutions with obsolescence in mind? What does an obsolescence management system look like for social programs, for grant making, all that sort of stuff? So obsolescence.
It's a great question, but I mean, I'll frame it in two ways. One, if you look at actually the legacy infrastructure in the internet, which we think is the coolest, hippest thing, there is much of the internet is being run on code which is over 40 to 40 years old now, because it's so deeply buried into the system. So the issue doesn't necessarily just exist in social programs. Actually, we're seeing it actually become an issue in many of the technologies we talk about. I think the other part of the question that I think is really important, in my view, Vinod, is also this conversation about audacity. So in the 1950s in the UK, we built the NHS, a national health service. We built Open University, which is now, I think, globally, there are 26 million people are being taught in open universities. I think one of the challenges that I think we face is that our ability to imagine change has become very small. And our audacity to imagine change has become even smaller. So we increasingly talk about social innovation as being the long-tail fix on a small, discrete, emergent problems, rather than actually looking at the macro-institutional infrastructure that we've got. We seem to have let go of all those conversations. So I think on one hand, I think what I was trying to point out was if you look at the scale of spend and the scale of capital, we have a problem. We don't understand actually the scale, and the fiscal wall that we're all facing is so significant that it isn't going to be dealt by incrementalism. It's that, and we're going to see a cut. The scale of cuts that we're starting to see are so significant. I think the whole compact requires us to reinvent those conversations. I think the other part of the conversation that is really important is actually also the kind of the mission quality of some of this story. What is the kind of sort of audacity at the center of the vision? You are going to see, I believe, in the next 10 years, a city-state turn around and say, we are going to build a citizen wage for everyone and change the economic conditions. I think, what does audacity look like that built the NHS in the 1950s? What would that same audacity look like now? I think social innovation has become a marginal conversation directly into the small tail-end problems, not dealing with the mass universal problems we all face, and not dealing with any of the institutional infrastructure problems that we all face, which is to do with actually most of our economy and spend is spent on curing or addressing the issues rather than any of the preventative investment stories. We all know the technologies of prevention even. We even have the data. Why don't we do it? And the reason why we don't do it is largely to do with how state accounting books are structured. State accounting books are structured on the basis of revenue to revenue. Tax in, tax out. There is no long-term liability, so we don't have a preventative investment model at the center of welfare. So I think how do we get back into the model and start to reinvent it is a fundamental problem. And I think it's about the audacity of the vision that actually was put together 60 years ago. We built large-scale institutions, as did you. So how do we start to reimagine this conversation and actually enable us all to be innovators? This isn't about culture change being employed from McKinsey's or some social entrepreneurs working in to sprinkle some magic dust, which is too often the story, right? We'll get some social innovators to come in and do a workshop. That isn't change. Your mechanisms of using procurement, these are all tools that require reinventing. Do you procure for outcomes? How do you procure? I think you have to start to reimagine these things, and you all have the instruments to do it. So I think your question's right, and I think the audacity in the system, and I think we face those challenges right now. I think the legacy conversations you're again right about, I think, but I suppose I sit there and say, well, I think most sectors are suffering with that challenge, even the internet sector, sort of technology sector. We know that most of the banking infrastructure, the finance infrastructure is running on more than 40 years worth of old code still. So what does obsolescence look like? Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. But in a way, I think if you look at it from an investment perspective, those questions become much more obvious rather than just a continuous dependency cycle. But yeah, open. Hi.
Hello. Hi. I enjoyed your talk very much, as many of the issues that I've been trying to deal with from a somewhat different perspective. I come from the world of foreign policy.
Absolutely.
And the conversation there is a little different. Though necessary, especially here in Canada. I agree with the advantages we have, but they've not been at all motivated or used. Most of the changes that are driving, that are being driven by global events outside this country, the 1%, the hollowing out of the middle class, et cetera, it's not something that is just domestic, it's also international. How do you start that conversation? Because it's a multifaceted conversation. It's a conversation with your own population about how do we go forward as a country internationally. It's also a conversation with foreigners. And the answers, in most cases, in traditional foreign policy terms, are different in both places. How do you arrange that conversation in a way that is constructive both of better international relations and of better support domestically? And I say this because of the paucity, and here I blame the internet, of information that the average citizen has access to about the world. The media are totally biased. You're not going to get a true story about any country. The media like good guys and bad guys. Well, the world's not like that. The world is full of gray guys who are doing their best in terms of their own country, what they perceive their own country's interests to be. So how do you start that conversation, both with Canadians and with people abroad, and recognizing the multifaceted nature of that conversation and the different kinds of responses that are required?
Thank you for that question. I think it's a wonderful question. In fact, Conrad came up to me just halfway through that, pretty much picking up the same point. And I think this is, and I didn't break this conversation, I didn't allude to this properly when I was talking earlier. I think you hit the nail on the head, it's a conversation. Too often, actually what you find is we're trying to give solutions. We say this is the solution. And what we don't focus on is building the political legitimacy of a conversation. I think if this nature of conversation, these challenges are no longer just about saying this is a solution, this is a policy intervention. Actually, we're going to have to rebuild the conversation ground up as to why these issues are interdependent and rebuild the consciousness of actors in this conversation. That requires humility, that requires empathy, that requires actually an openness to build that conversation. I think too problematic has been that we end up with a kind of what I'd say, hide everything, project, and try to deliver a solution and build a political conversation around that solution. I think we have to start much earlier and build that discourse. And unless you build this discourse and the political legitimacy at a citizen level, you never build the political architecture for these instruments of change. And I think you're right. One of the big, why I say glibly, but with a genuine space, which is why is Canada the best hope for the West right now, is actually a capacity to start a conversation. And no longer are states isolated in the same way. Discourse moves, discourse shifts. How can you host a different conversation, a different discourse around the role of citizenship in that process? I think you're right, it's an interdependent story. And it will only be changed, not just in isolating it from a Canadian level. This is why I often have problems about localism versus globalism. This discourse is a problematic discourse. It's convenient, it's politically convenient to talk about localism versus globalism. I would argue that sets up one person or one territory versus another territory. And actually what we need to be talking about is proximities. And proximities of relationships are not necessarily local or global, but they're about your relationships and your system interdependencies. The reality is most of the stuff that you have around you is interdependent on a global food network and global supply chains. So we have to talk about proximities in a new way. If we fall into these dichotomies of local versus global, Canada versus something else, actually this becomes problematic. So what does system leadership for Canada look like? Actually, you were the great peace builders. You understood actually this existed in a world or at a system level. What does that look like in the 21st century? I think you have the architecture for some of that conversation. But you're right, it's not going to be done by isolating ourselves, which has been the historic move of the last 10 to 15 years to go into a competitive narrative on localism, whether it's statewide or non. So I think this is about rebuilding the conversation. Without it, we won't be able to shift the dynamics of the story. And that requires us to be vulnerable and open about the challenges we face and build the intelligence all the way from the ground up. That's the only way I see it happening. And we've done it at the level of cities, and that's the way you end up having to do it, people by people. That's why I talk about it being a movement conversation. This isn't about straightforward leadership. Actually, when you go to straightforward leadership around decisions, you get to very naive level conversations, and we get into a Donald Trump world of politics. It's unfortunate, but true. He appears truthful to, let's not laugh about it. He appears truthful to a segment of the population. That means we have not built the political constituency for a different discourse. That is our failing. That is an institutional failing of not building that discourse. Like I said, the democracy is not the vote. That is just the icing on the cake. Unless you build the democracy of capital, knowledge, and capacity to activate, you don't have a functioning democracy. So we have to go right back to the ground on rebuilding democracy. It is about the power to create society. And that power comes with knowledge and capital being structured. So I think this is actually genuine hard work to rebuild this conversation and the enlightenment in that system and recognize the interdependencies of the choices we make and what those issues are, even at a foreign policy level. It's not the full answer, but I think it is about rebuilding the conversation, and we're going to have to build it from the ground up. It won't be given to us by political leaders singularly by themselves. Please.
Part of the problem is our media. I mean, we are prisoners of what we learn and read and see. This is TV, this is newspapers such as they are, community bulletin boards in Canada these days, and the internet. If I want a recipe of an Indian dish, and I type it into Google, I will get the white recipe, white people for food for white people. I've got to go to Google India before I'll get an Indian recipe. How many people do that in terms of more important things than recipes? We are, in fact, with the internet and with our newspapers, our focus is more and more, becoming more and more narrow. And that is a big issue in arranging this kind of conversation, which requires a degree of openness and understanding, which is not exactly provided by tourism. You need a lot of other stuff.
You do, and you do. But I would argue that social media is actually opening that conversation up. If you look at actually newspapers, their decline in circulation, if you look at TV and its decline in presence, actually what you are creating is a new democratized mechanism. The question is, are we really powerful in building conversations on that? No. Are we becoming actually natives to building that discourse? No. The architecture of truth, which was historically the domain of institutions, has been democratized by things like social media. Truth is no longer allocated by the Royal Society of Science. That isn't how it works anymore. We have to rebuild this conversation at the level of actual social media, which is going to require us to build a legitimacy step by step. And I think this goes back to fundamentally how we use this media. I think we have an opportune moment. Platforms like Twitter, social media, they're opening up this discourse, democratizing the freedom of actual expression. Now, that expression can become a tyranny of the mob, which we are seeing, as well as the tyranny of the kind of opportunity of enlightenment. But that's a conversation. That's about, everyone here being an active voice. Everyone here talking and being active and being actually against people who are shutting down debate. The tyranny of those conversations. I think that's about us as new citizens in this democracy have to be enlightened about it. It always comes down to individuals and all of our roles as citizens, in my view.
We have time for about 2-3 more questions, and let's keep them short. Tomorrow, actually, there is a dinner with Indy Johar. For those of you who haven't registered yet, you can do that just outside of this room for longer conversations. You're welcome to join. You have another question?
I am used to giving lectures, not asking questions. I'm a philosophy professor. I'll try. Thank you very much for your talk. And my question is not so much about your talk, which I recognize you were doing on one level. But my question is really, I believe that people, particularly in environmental ethics, have been talking about interconnectedness for a long time. Yeah. Deep ecologists are profoundly criticized by ecofeminists for promoting interconnectedness without having an analysis of oppression. From my perspective, what is really lacking is a fundamental ground-based values that underlie interconnectedness. Interconnectedness, if it is not based on empathy, sympathy, compassion, love, promoting virtue, can turn into tyranny and control. Now, this is not so much a problem that I have with your talk. It's really, I think, an issue that needs to be kept in mind, which I will end by saying that John Stuart Mill in the 19th century, I think, saw the whole thing, saw everything. So we need to sometimes go back to history for wisdom.
I would totally agree with the story, or with your point about empathy, and actually the human relationships at the center of the story. I think when you talk about systems, actually it's very easy. I could very easily make a case around how tight systems are actually mechanisms of control. You can design systems to be tight, which actually reduce the choice of the actors to virtually zero. I'll give you a good example. This is a piece of work we're doing around reframing poverty. Poverty is currently understood as a relative wage. 60%, less than 60%, absolute poverty is a definitive title, but most poverty metrics are built around that. In the UK, I think the percentage is 60% of the population, if they were to lose their job, would only have savings for less than 6 weeks. The average time to get a new job is currently running at 3.5 months. That would mean that in any crisis situation, these people would most likely lose their households or housing. So when you look at the choice in that system, is very little. So when you start to talk about system tightness and the poverty of actual freedom in a system, you start to understand these things in different ways. I don't think we've got into those conversations yet. I think our terms around poverty are still old-fashioned viewpoints, rather than understanding the poverty of choice and the poverty of freedom, that actually is about the sovereignty of us as individuals and citizens. And I think your point about empathy, if you want to talk about intelligent systems, that's why I often don't talk about God viewpoints, but actually system intelligence, system empathy, and all these kind of characteristics, they're about the relationships between people. And I think only when you start to organize it from that level do we start to talk about change in a meaningful way. That's where leadership as opposed to management. That's where I talk about conditions as opposed to actually rules. So I think all these things are fundamental, and I think these are part of the characteristics. You're absolutely right. And I think when we go back, we have to start to redefine. In a systems worldview, I could classify many people in work as being close to being slavery. Here's a proposition over your tea. Over dessert. In 100 years' time, will we look back at modern day work as actually a slavery? Will we look back at it and say, I gave up my freedom in order to find money to survive? I would propose to you we will. Now imagine reframing that conversation. That is the scale of vision that we need to talk about. And that's why when I was talking about the abundance economics, we were talking about fundamentally a different worldview on what is about actually human thriving. So when we talk about poverty, what language are we talking from? An industrial idea of poverty? A relative idea of consumerist buy? Or actually the poverty of freedom and choice, which is much more fundamental to to our sovereignty as individuals? How do we start to reimagine these conversations are fundamental?
I have a question. Oh, there is another question. Go ahead, please.
Hello.
Sorry to catch you. Good evening. I found that your presentation very thought-provoking, very interesting. I learned a lot. Along the lines, I remember you mentioned welfare, that it's an investment. I totally agree with this idea. So if our Prime Minister is here with us, how would you propose this to him if he's sitting amongst us right now?
I would say, look at your 400 billion spend yearly and turn that into actually investment into people. Psychologically, that's the first trick. That's all you have to do. 400 billion is your social investments, social spend. Now you're investing into people to unlock their capacities. How would you invest differently? One of the things that will change is you'll suddenly start to not focus on curative interventions or managing diseases. Your money will go into preventative investment very, very quickly. Prevention, and it will go into the outcomes. We know, for example, noise levels has a high level relationship with heart disease. We know particulate pollution has huge impacts with it. You would change many things once you reframe that conversation as an investment discourse. I really genuinely believe you just have to change the lens. The rest, actually, there are so many more smart people in this room would know how to deal with it and actually allocate it. So actually the tricks, and this is why, in a way, I often talk about the dark matter. The tricks are actually dealing with the dark matter, which is reframing some of these things. We know what to do. We know about walkable neighborhoods. We know many of the solutions. We just haven't built the mechanisms to unlock them. And all these solutions end up being what I call black swans, funded by great foundations who will extraordinarily fund black swan solutions, but actually we never drive the level of systems level change required to deliver them all across the board. So I think actually much of the work is in the backstream in this dark matter space. So I would say reframe it as a 400 billion a year fund continuously investing into human capital development. Imagine that conversation.
Great. Next question, please.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I really appreciated hearing it. I guess I'm from the Bay Area, Northern California, and I thought it was really interesting that you drew on two major things that are happening in Northern California right now. One is what you called the California Innovation Model, and the other is the Black Lives Matter movement.
Yeah.
And I think this is interesting because these two movements, as you frame them, have been as absolute loggerheads with one another, and particularly around the way that they manifest materially, who can participate in these movements, and the fact that what you call the innovation model is causing very rapid and massive amounts of gentrification across San Francisco and into Oakland, which is where I live. And I just thought I would ask you to reflect upon, or I guess ask you how you reconcile the difference between the idealistic way that you're talking about this model and its very material impacts on people's life and I guess in real life.
So I was out in Oakland in about more than 4 weeks ago with Impact Hub Oakland and Lisa and Conda out there in the team. So this is how I would frame it. I think what's been happening in the Californian sort of venture capital model is a bubble. It's a bubble exercise in actually a different human capital development model. I think what they're developing is a different way to unlock human capital. Now imagine if we took that same model and applied it at the level of Oakland as a city and said we would actually invest. Citizen wage is a good example of actually saying we're going to create structural abundance. How would you organize an economy fundamentally differently, taking the learning that's happening in the micro bubble and applying it? I think that's what they're experimenting. As Henry Ford experimented in his factory to build a new economics around production and consumption, I think what they're doing is experimenting at a different way. And I think the key issue is how do we learn from that and how do we bring that back out to actually unlock everyone? Innovation is not just about the high value. I think that's the other thing. Innovation, I want to reimagine the corner shop. Unless we talk about innovation as a democratized idea, which is about actually empowering everyone to be in purpose and create meaning in their world, I don't think we're really talking about what it means to be human. So I think it's about learning from the Californian model in a way and bringing that back to a wider conversation. That is, I think, the scale of the opportunity and the scale of kind of conversation. They're talking about abundant capital unlocking a different economics. And I think that can be applied at a state level. And we're already seeing those discourses into play, and that's not a coincidence, I think. So that's the reconciliation, and I think there's a space there. What I'm articulating is actually there's a way to bring these two worlds together.
I think we stayed at a very high level of discussion, so I'll ask a practical question. All of us here represent some organizations that then make up the bigger, larger institutions. So I'm wondering, from at an organizational scale, what is one of the most common failures that we fail to accept? Given the vast amount of work that you've done with different people around the world, what is one of the most common failures that we just fail to accept and recognize?
I would say the biggest issue is recognizing that in order to deliver our mission that we have in our corporate forms, that we're interdependent on other people. And we're interdependent on other organizations to deliver against that mission. And also, most of our missions end up being private little documents that sit in convenient little nice books, but we aren't publicly held accountable against our missions. How do we start to make our missions interoperable, where other people can actually join and partake in those missions in new ways? That's where we're seeing lots of conversations. Unless we can actually build a different type of leadership model. I will add one more point to that. So that's one thing, the mission. The second thing is actually what I learned in Norway. Norway has the largest number of women leaders on the board of public sector organizations and public sector. That has meant the culture of collaboration, whether we like it or not, is way better than pretty much anywhere in the world. I think if you look at venture capitalists, they're already saying women on boards actually improve the performance of companies, much better than all male companies, much better. I think there's actually one of the key factors would be gender equality on actual boards would drive our different discourse and a different dialogue of change. It's a really simple thing, but the reason why we're working in Norway is without that culture of structural collaboration, you can't do this work. And we need to get to that structural culture of collaboration, which has to sit at the top level to be part of that conversation and understand our interdependency. That's one of the first things I would say any grant-giving organization right now which is working in this sector should say 50% board, male, female, full stop. And that would drive the biggest change.
We're in good shape federally, but we still have a lot of work to do on the ground. Bob?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Bob Hewish from Dalhousie University. Indy, I loved your talk. You had me all the way through. I was there. I was taking notes. And then difficult conversations, right? You had me all the way until you mentioned the city-states of the past, right? That we could look to see that this new economy is going to go back to, as you put it, like the Renaissance era, where city-states pre-Renaissance, right? Yeah. And I thought, that's great. But those were some pretty vicious and divisive states that put a lot of energy and a lot of intention into trying to keep people out of those states. So I thought, okay, wait a second. Okay, we're going in the past. Maybe that's not right. So I went, in my head, way in the future. And did anybody really into Star Trek? Yeah. Excellent! Because when I was doing my PhD as a Trudeau scholar, I remember my interest was in universal healthcare. Yeah. And they had that in Star Trek. Like, it didn't matter what planet you were from, you were going to get healthcare. And that inspired my PhD research. And my book is actually named Where No Doctor Has Gone Before. So anyway, And I started to think about it a bit more, that some of the technological innovation that you put forward, I think, wait a second, iPhones, like tricorders, you know, and somebody teleported something last year in a science lab in Geneva. And I thought, all of this scientific inspiration has come by looking in the future in this way. But what about the social and economic? Yeah. What about that? Because even though it was just one television show, Gene Roddenberry, who said that, you know, there should be no discrimination between history or space. And they tried to articulate that. How can we really get to that point? Because there's been some philosophers and some economists who actually study Star Trek, like, how cool is that? Who've actually said they actually live in a post-scarcity economy. Absolutely. And that's exactly what you mentioned as well. So what is it that keeps us fearful, that has the potential to be divisive? If we had a new economy of city-states, what would it be that would still keep us with that element of being divisive? How can we get to a truly post-scarcity economy and wear really cool uniforms in the future?
Brilliant. I'm with you all the way. So just to sort of, so here's my thesis. I think that's where we're headed. Gene had it right. I think where we are, though, is in a transition state. And the transition state problem that we exist in is that what I really meant when I was talking about new medievalism is actually this idea of iteration and craft. And so a very relationship, proximity network-driven economy, which allows for very high levels of empathy, very high levels of relationship and innovation. And why I think cities are that phase change space is because they have sufficient social identity and convening power, movement building power, to allow for those things to crystallize. So in a phase state situation, I think they're a moment to unlock this story. I don't think that's where we end. I think that's just where the points of intervention begin. I think the end point, I think, is pretty much well predicted by Gene in a way. I think that's where we're headed as we recognize interdependency at a global level. And more, all our crises are recognizing that stuff. Even if we look at the kind of current issue that we're all dealing with in terms of actually the kind of issues out of Syria and other places. So we are talking about interdependency and we're recognizing that constantly. So I was really pointing to this middle phase state. Where do we see the first points of change? And we're seeing them there. And in a way, the medievalism is actually a counterpoint to this idea of projection, project and change, to a craft and iterative idea of change, which is very relational, and it's relational economics rather than projective economics. And that was really the point I was making. But I agree with you wholeheartedly. Star Trek is the future.
Well, I think that's a wonderful ending point. Thank you all for your questions and enjoy the rest of your dessert.
Thank you.